In history books, the Third Reich is often portrayed as the pinnacle of engineering for its time. We're told stories of high-tech Tiger tanks, the first jet fighters, and V-2 rockets. But if you look at this weapon, the Gewehr 43, you see a completely different story. A story of how a master race of engineers was forced to admit defeat to a common Soviet riflesmith. Look at its appearance. It looks as if it were forged in haste in the basement of a besieged factory. Its surface isn't polished, it's crude, pitted with casting marks and rough textures. These are the scars of 1943, the year the German war machine began to realize it was hopelessly losing the arms race in the East. At the start of the war, the Wehrmacht made a fatal mistake. While the German command forced its soldiers to manually cycle the bolts of their Mauser carbines, they were confronted by the Soviet SVT-40. For the German infantryman, it was a true nightmare. For every shot he fired, the Red Army soldier answered with 3 or 4. It turned out that the primitive Soviets had armed their infantry with semi-automatic weapons far more effectively than technological Germany. The Germans tried to create their own answer independently. The result was the Gewehr 41. A complex, heavy, and utterly non-functional rifle that jammed at the first handful of Russian dust. It was a technological dead end and a national disgrace. Nazi engineers were left with no choice. To avoid total failure, they had to take a desperate step. They took captured Tokarev rifles, disassembled them down to the last screw, and simply copied their enemy's gas system. Today, the Gewehr 43 is one of the most expensive and sought-after trophies for collectors worldwide. But its price tag of several $1,000s isn't a payment for build quality. It's the price of a monument to the moment German pride was broken by Soviet functionality. In this video, we will break down the G43 into its smallest details. We'll find out why it was called the poor man's sniper rifle, how factory sabotage turned these rifles into traps for the Germans themselves, and whether the German copy truly managed to surpass the Soviet original. Our investigation begins. In the history of Third Reich small arms, there is no specimen more controversial than the Gewehr 43. To some, it represents a late-hour technological surge. To others, it is proof that the German war machine began to fracture long before 1945. To this day, collectors and historians debate, was this rifle a worthy answer to the American M1 Garand? Or did it merely highlight Germany's desperate struggle to keep up in the field of individual semi-automatic weapons? To understand the essence of the G43, we must view it not just as a mechanical device, but as the product of immense pressure. Pressure from Soviet forces, who by 1941 were already mass employing the Tokarev semi-automatic rifles, and pressure from the German High Command, which realized far too late that the era of bolt-action carbines had come to an end. In this episode, we will conduct a detailed audit of the Gewehr 43. We won't settle for surface-level facts. Our goal is to understand how German designers attempted to salvage a hopeless situation by grafting a Soviet gas-operated system onto German architecture. We will discuss technical specifications, the performance of the ZF-4 sniper scope, and why late-war issues of this rifle are considered the most dangerous, both for the enemy and for the shooter himself. For those who value deep historical analytics and detailed technical breakdowns, subscribing to the channel is the best way to support the creation of this content. We strive to bring you facts from archival reports and memoirs that rarely make it into mainstream reviews. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you consider the G43 an ergonomic masterpiece? Or is it simply a crude copy of someone else's ideas? Now, let's go back to 1940, to the origins of a project that began with absurd requirements and ended in one of the most massive technical failures in the history of the Wehrmacht. We begin our breakdown of the backstory, the disaster known as the Gewehr 41. In the early 1940s, the German army found itself in a bizarre position. On one hand, Germany had produced the finest machine guns of the era, the MG34 and MG42. On the other, the average Wehrmacht infantryman was still heading into battle with a rifle whose core concept was stuck in the 19th century. The German Army Ordnance Department, Heereswaffenamt, understood the need for a semi-automatic rifle, but their approach to developing one was akin to trying to reinvent the wheel with square corners. In 1940, officials issued 3 rigid requirements to designers that seem nonsensical by today's standards. First, there were to be no holes drilled into the barrel for gas porting. The generals seriously feared that a gas port would lead to rapid barrel wear and a decrease in accuracy. Second, there were to be no moving parts on the exterior of the weapon. And third, the rifle had to feature a full manual bolt backup in case the semi-automatic action failed. These requirements effectively tied the hands of the engineers. 2 major companies, Mauser and Walther, entered the competition for the contract, both trying to appease the bureaucrats. The result was the gas trap system, gas fang, located at the muzzle of the rifle. Instead of simply bleeding off a portion of the gases through a hole in the barrel, engineers were forced to catch them using a special cone attachment at the very end of the muzzle as the bullet exited. The final product was the Gewehr 41, and it was a mechanical nightmare. Mauser's version, the G41M, was so heavy and complex that its production was scrapped almost immediately. Walther's version, the G41W, proved slightly more successful, but still suffered from critical defects. The massive muzzle attachment ruined the rifle's balance, and the system would instantly clog with carbon fouling. In real frontline conditions, where a soldier couldn't always clean his weapon with surgical precision, the gas trap became a trap for the shooter. The soot from the aggressive gunpowder would practically weld the parts together, making semi-automatic cycling impossible. When these rifles arrived on the Eastern Front in 1941, German soldiers cursed them. The G41 jammed from dust, from the freezing cold, and simply from sustained fire. Weighing in at nearly 5 kilograms, 11 pounds, it was a massive burden during long marches. At the same time, German troops were increasingly capturing Soviet SVT-38s and SVT-40s. To their utter astonishment, they discovered that the primitive Soviet designers weren't afraid to drill holes in their barrels. The Russian Tokarev rifle was lighter, simpler, and most importantly, it actually worked. The failure of the Gewehr 41 was so blatant that it couldn't be hidden, even by propaganda. The Wehrmacht needed a new weapon, and they needed it immediately. German pride took a heavy hit. It became clear that their own sacred rules of design were leading them toward defeat. Nazi engineers had to admit that their enemy had been smarter. This realization was the starting point for the Gewehr 43. The German genius decided that if it couldn't out-engineer the Soviets, it would have to follow their lead, or at least copy them. By 1942, the German High Command was in a state of quiet panic. Soldiers on the front lines were mass abandoning their new G41 rifles, preferring captured Soviet SVT-40s instead. This wasn't just a disgrace, it was a disaster. The German engineers at Walther, under the leadership of Fritz Walther, received a direct order: stop trying to reinvent the wheel and build something that actually works, just like the Russians did. Fritz Walther realized that the old German dogma that drilling holes in the barrel was forbidden had been a grave mistake. The Soviet designer Fedor Tokarev had already proven this. Using captured SVT rifles as a blueprint, the Germans discovered a brilliantly simple system. Instead of the bulky gas trap at the muzzle, they simply drilled a gas port into the top of the barrel. The operating principle was copied almost entirely. After a shot was fired, the powder gases passed through this port and pushed a short-stroke gas piston. This piston delivered a sharp blow to an operating rod, which in turn threw the bolt carrier back. This short-stroke system was light, reliable, and most importantly, it didn't ruin the weapon's balance. However, the Gewehr 43 was not a blind copy of the SVT-40. The Germans retained their own bolt-locking system, which they had originally developed for the G41. This consisted of two pivoting locking flaps on the sides of the bolt. Ironically, this system vaguely resembled older Soviet designs by Tokarev, but in the German implementation, it was refined to an industrial standard. The Germans also made one critical change that made their rifle more user-friendly. Unlike the Soviet SVT, where the magazine was often semi-detachable, and soldiers typically loaded it from the top using clips, the Gewehr 43 received a fully detachable 10-round box magazine. This allowed the infantrymen to swap magazines as quickly as those using submachine guns. The transition from the G41 to the G43 was swift. The designations changed in 1943, and the new rifle emerged looking like a hybrid of two different schools: Soviet functionality married to German architecture. But beneath this outward power lay a deep crisis. To launch mass production of the G43, Germany had to abandon high-quality metal finishing. The rifle had to be mass-produced, cheap, and fast to assemble. This is where we begin to see the rough casting marks and the careless finish. German factories could no longer afford the luxury of perfect polishing. From this moment on, the Gewehr 43 became a mirror of the Reich's failing economy. But before this rifle reached the hands of the soldiers, it had to undergo one more transformation. It was destined to become not just a semi-auto rifle, but a mass-produced sniper tool. In the next chapter, we will break down the internal workings of the G43 and understand why this rifle was equally dangerous to the enemy and to its owner. If you place a Model 1898 Mauser carbine and a Gewehr 43 side by side, the difference in manufacturing philosophy is visible to the naked eye. The KAR-98K is a product of the old school, where every single part was flawlessly machined from solid steel. The Gewehr 43 is a child of total war. Its receiver was made using a rough casting method that received almost no final polishing. The Germans called this ship, fast, rough-hewn machining. This is why we see that characteristic pitted or bumpy surface on the rifle's body, resembling crocodile skin. It wasn't a design choice. It was a way to save thousands of man-hours. However, inside this crude shell lay a very curious mechanism. The G43's locking system deserves special attention. It utilized two pivoting locking flaps that, when the bolt closed, moved outward and locked into recesses in the receiver. It was a very compact and strong design, capable of withstanding the powerful 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser rifle cartridge. It operated smoothly, but it had one fatal flaw that manifested over time. The main problem with the Gewehr 43 was its overgassing. Remember how we mentioned the Germans copied the gas system from the Soviet SVT-40? Well, they made one critical mistake. Fedor Tokarev's rifle had a gas regulator with 5 settings, allowing the soldier to adjust the volume of diverted gas based on weather conditions or carbon buildup. The Germans decided this was too complex for mass production and removed the regulator, making the gas port as wide as possible to ensure the rifle would cycle under any conditions. This meant that with every shot, the bolt carrier was thrown back with immense, excessive force. The piston literally hammered the mechanism with such violence that, over time, the rear of the receiver would begin to crack. For a modern collector, this is a nightmare. If you fire an original Gewehr 43 with standard ammunition without a specialized modern shooter's kit, a modified gas plug, the rifle can literally destroy itself. In the worst-case scenario, the bolt could fly back out of the receiver straight into the shooter's face. The trigger mechanism was hammer-fired and featured a pull that was quite good for a standard infantry weapon. But even here, cost-cutting measures were evident. Many small internal parts were made of cheap alloys that wore out quickly. Despite this, the rifle was reasonably accurate. Its potential as a semi-automatic weapon allowed for rapid fire while maintaining a decent group at ranges of 400 to 500 yards. The 10-round magazine was detachable, yet German logistics were so conservative that soldiers were often issued only 1 or 2 spare magazines. It was expected that the soldier would reload the rifle from the top using standard 5-round stripper clips from the Mauser carbine. Special guides were even milled into the bolt carrier for this purpose. It was a strange hybrid, a modern detachable magazine used as if it were an antique, fixed part of the rifle. Technically, the Gewehr 43 was a tool operating at the very edge of its capabilities. It was a powerful rifle, but its design lacked the margin of safety and durability found in the American M1 Garand. It was built to fire a few hundred rounds, fulfill its mission, and disappear in the furnace of war. Yet, it was this fragile power that made it the perfect base for the next step, an attempt to create the Reich's mass-produced sniper weapon. The Gewehr 43 had one specific feature that made it unique among all other service rifles of the Second World War. If you look at the right side of the receiver on any production model, you will see a milled integral rail, a specialized mounting point for an optical sight. This was an unprecedented move. The German High Command intended for every single G43 produced to be capable of transforming into a sniper rifle at a moment's notice. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with the idea of marksman superiority. Stunned by the devastating effectiveness of Soviet snipers, he demanded the creation of an army of marksmen where every other soldier could strike targets at long distances. To achieve this, the standard ZF4 Zielfernrohr Vorfach scope was developed. This was a compact 4-power optic that, much like the rifle itself, had clear Soviet roots. German engineers had carefully studied the Soviet PU scope from the Mosin Nagant and created their own version, making it as simple, cheap to produce, and as easy to maintain as possible. In theory, the plan was perfect. An infantryman equipped with a semi-automatic rifle and a ZF4 scope became a formidable force. He could not only deliver accurate fire at ranges of 400 to 600 yards, but also quickly correct his misses without losing sight of the target, as he didn't need to manually cycle a bolt. In modern terms, the G43 was the world's first attempt to create a mass-issued designated marksman rifle, DMR, a support weapon filling the gap between the average rifleman and the elite sniper. However, the reality on the front lines quickly dispelled these ambitions. The problem lay in the very nature of the G43's production. We've already discussed the rough casting and the haste of the factories. A sniper weapon requires precision engineering, perfect fitment of parts, and high-quality barrels. But by 1944, German factories were chasing quotas, and the quality of G43 barrels varied from acceptable to outright poor. Professional German snipers quickly grew disillusioned with the new rifle. Due to the violent action of the gas-operated system, the rifle vibrated heavily during firing, which negatively impacted accuracy. The scope mount, which simply slid onto the rail and was secured by a tension lever, often worked itself loose under recoil, causing the 0-2 drift. As a result, most of the Wehrmacht's elite shooters preferred to stick with their old, proven, bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, equipped with more powerful 6x optics. To them, the G43 was simply not reliable or accurate enough for high-stakes missions. Nonetheless, the G43 with the ZF4 scope became a common sight. It gave the average soldier an advantage in defensive battles, allowing them to pick off enemy officers and machine gun crews from a safer distance. But there was a catch. The optics made the rifle even heavier, and its silhouette with the scope was very distinct. Soviet soldiers knew that if a German held a rifle with a tube on top, he was priority target number 1. Thus, Hitler's attempt to turn every soldier into a sniper failed due to the technical shortcomings of a mass-produced product. The Gewehr 43 remained in history as a rifle that could have been the ideal sniper tool if Germany had possessed the time for refinement and high-quality materials. Instead, it became a symbol of an industry trying to replace quality with quantity. In the next chapter, we will see how this reflected on the production process itself and who was actually assembling these rifles in the shadows of the crumbling factories. When we look at a Gewehr 43 today in a collection or a museum, its coarseness is striking. But behind those porous casting marks and the careless finish lies one of the darkest pages in the history of German weaponry. By 1944, Allied aviation had turned German industrial life into a living hell. The massive Walther and Mauser plants were under constant bombardment, forcing the Reich to seek new, desperate methods of production. The solution was found in the most horrific place imaginable: concentration camps. A huge portion of the components and the final assembly of the Gewehr 43 were carried out by prisoner labor. The key facility was the Gustloff-Werke II, built directly on the grounds of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Here, thousands of people, living in subhuman conditions, were forced to assemble weapons for their own executioners. This is where one of the most enduring legends of the Gewehr 43 was born: the legend of mass sabotage. The prisoners understood that every rifle they assembled was another chance for the Reich to hold out for one more day. In the reports of German inspectors from 1944 and 1945, complaints about unexplainable failures in new rifles appeared constantly. Prisoners took immense risks. They would intentionally leave screws loose, use defective metal, or skip the critical heat treatment stages for internal parts. As a result, a rifle that looked like a masterpiece of engineering on paper could literally explode in a German soldier's hands during his very first firefight. By this time, the Reich's economy had entered a state of total degradation. High-quality wood for stocks was replaced with cheap plywood, and the upper handguard was eventually made from bakelite, an early form of plastic that frequently cracked under the intense heat of the barrel. While early production runs of the G43 still attempted to meet quality standards, by early 1945, rifles were leaving the factory gates in a condition that could hardly be called German quality. Furthermore, the shortage of high-quality steel meant that the rifle barrels wore out significantly faster than pre-war models. This ultimately buried any hope of making the G43 a reliable, mass-produced sniper tool. The accuracy of the rifle fluctuated wildly from one batch to the next, a fact that German frontline troops knew all too well. Rumors spread among the ranks that certain series of rifles were cursed, when in reality, it was simply the result of the Reich's desperate attempt to replace skilled labor with slave labor. Thus, the Gewehr 43 became a monument to the agony of the Third Reich. It was a weapon born of fear and haste, assembled by the hands of those who prayed for their master's downfall. It was modern in concept, but deeply flawed in execution. In the next chapter, we will see how all of this reflected on the actual battlefield, and why, in the duel between German, Soviet, and American approaches to semi-automatic weaponry, the winner was not the one anyone expected at the start of the war. To finally assess the place of the Gewehr 43 in history, we must line it up against its two primary rivals, the Soviet SVT-40 and the American M1 Garand. In 1944, these three rifles represented three distinct schools of engineering thought, and each carried its own price on the battlefield. Let's start with the American M1 Garand. The M1 is the only example in the history of the Second World War where a semi-automatic rifle became the standard-issue primary weapon for an entire army, rather than just for select elite groups. The Garand was the embodiment of American industrial might. It was incredibly reliable, rugged, and had a massive barrel life. Its 8-round en-bloc clip system is often criticized because it's difficult to top off, but in reality, it provided a phenomenal rate of fire. In a duel of reliability, the G43 stood no chance against the M1. The American rifle was built for a long service life, while the German rifle was built to survive just a few weeks. On the other side of the front stood the SVT-40, the teacher of the German Gewehr. Technically speaking, the Soviet rifle was more advanced than the G43. The SVT featured a gas regulator, which allowed a soldier to adjust the action for specific conditions, a feature the Germans stripped from their rifle to simplify production. The SVT was longer, more elegant, and when properly maintained, more accurate. But therein lay the problem. The SVT was too complex for a raw conscript, whereas the Gewehr 43, for all its coarseness, was more intuitive to operate. Where the Gewehr 43 truly beat both of its competitors was in its feeding system. The 10-round detachable box magazine was the most modern solution of the time. It gave the German soldier an edge in fire density, while the American waited for the characteristic ping of the ejecting clip, and the Soviet soldier struggled to force stripper clips into the SVT from the top. The German could simply drop a spent magazine and slap in a new one. If the Germans had possessed proper logistics and issued 5 magazines to every soldier, the G43 could have been the queen of close-quarters combat. However, the overall assessment was grim for the Wehrmacht. The Garand won through build quality and sheer numbers. The SVT won because it arrived earlier and set the developmental trajectory for the entire industry. The Gewehr 43 remained in history as a rifle of compromises. The Germans took the Soviet gas system but stripped it of its reliability. They created a modern magazine, but couldn't produce it in sufficient quantities. They put a sniper rail on every receiver, but couldn't provide high-quality barrels. In the end, the G43 lost the battle. By 1945, it was clear that the future belonged to more compact weapons firing intermediate cartridges, like the Sturmgewehr 44. The Gewehr 43 was the final gasp of the full-power semi-automatic battle rifle era. It was an attempt by the Reich to cheat time, using the ideas of others to salvage its own prestige. In our final chapter, we will summarize what became of this rifle after the war and what lesson it left for future generations of gunsmiths. May 1945 marked the end of the Third Reich, but not the end of the Gewehr 43. When Soviet and American troops entered Berlin, they found thousands of these rifles, abandoned in trenches, left in warehouses, and held in the hands of exhausted Volkssturm soldiers. For the Allies, the G43 became one of the most highly sought-after trophies. Soldiers brought them home across the ocean as symbols of victory over a technologically advanced enemy, often without realizing just how fragile and problematic the mechanism truly was. The rifle's post-war fate was surprisingly long. While Germany was demilitarized, other nations were in no hurry to scrap the G43. Czechoslovakia, possessing a powerful arms manufacturing base, not only kept captured rifles in service, but continued to utilize its design elements. Yugoslavia also maintained Gewehrs in its reserves well into the 1960s, valuing them for their powerful cartridge and the ability to mount optics. But if we set aside nostalgia and collector value, what verdict does history deliver on the rifle itself? Could the Gewehr 43 have changed the course of the war if it had appeared, say, in 1941? The answer is almost certainly no. Undoubtedly, at a platoon or company level, saturating the infantry with semi-automatic fire could have inflicted massive damage on the enemy. But no rifle can fix strategic planning failures or a total collapse of logistics. The G43 was an attempt to treat the symptoms of a disease while the body was already dying. The Gewehr 43 remains in history as a monument to missed opportunities. It was a weapon created under the pressure of fear of Soviet power. The Germans were forced to copy the ideas of those they officially considered primitive, and this became the main lesson of the Second World War for the entire arms industry. There is no room for ideology on the battlefield. Only functionality rules. Today, the Gewehr 43 is a fragile legend. Modern owners must handle it with extreme care, often installing modern gas pistons to prevent the rifle from destroying itself during firing. It is the perfect metaphor for the entire German war machine of 1944, menacing on the outside, but operating at its absolute limit on the inside. This concludes our investigation. We have traveled the path from the failed G41 and its gas traps to the recognition of the superiority of the Soviet Tokarev system. We have seen how slave labor and sabotage in concentration camps etched their bloody lines into the blueprints of this weapon. The Gewehr 43 did not become a weapon of victory, but it served as an invaluable lesson for all subsequent generations of designers. What do you think? Does the G43 deserve the title of one of the best rifles of the war, despite all its flaws? Or was it just a late and unsuccessful clone of the Soviet SVT? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us continue to dig deeper into the history of the technologies that changed the world. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.